The portrait returned without warning, dragged out of the forest as if the trees themselves had grown tired of guarding it. Its frame was rotted, its canvas warped by damp air, yet the faces within remained disturbingly intact. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, a family posed stiffly, eyes fixed forward, frozen in the formal stillness of another century. But the longer it was studied, the more unease settled into the room, like a presence that refused to leave. Under restored light, shapes emerged where there should have been none. Shadows between trees behind the family, mouths half open, eyes reflecting something that was never meant to be photographed. Late at night, those who examined the image reported the same sensation, the feeling of being overheard. A low murmur crept in when the room fell silent, not coming from the walls, but from the portrait itself. It was then historians understood why this image had vanished for 100 years. It was not lost. It had been buried. And now that it had resurfaced, the past was no longer willing to stay quiet. The discovery happened by accident, the kind that history pretends is coincidence. A logging crew working near the edge of an old forest uncovered a collapsed root cellar buried beneath decades of leaves, soil, and silence. Inside, among rusted tools and water-damaged crates, one wooden box stood apart, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with hand-forged nails. The men noted how strange it was that the wood had not rotted like everything else around it, as if the ground itself had preserved it deliberately. When the box was forced open, the smell was not of decay, but of cold air and old varnish, sharp enough to make them step back. Inside lay a portrait, its surface cracked but intact, the paint dulled by time yet stubbornly refusing to fade. It showed a family standing at the edge of a forest clearing, their clothing formal, their posture rigid, their expressions carefully arranged for the long exposure of an early camera. Nothing about it should have survived 100 years underground, let alone in a place where no record showed any settlement had ever existed. The men argued briefly about its value before handing it over to local authorities, unaware that they were reopening something deliberately closed. When historians examined the back of the frame, they found a date etched faintly into the wood, exactly 1 century old. No artist's name. No studio mark. No location. Just a date and a symbol that did not match any known registry. What unsettled them most was the soil still clinging to the corners of the frame, packed tight as if the portrait had been buried with care rather than discarded. Someone had taken the time to hide it, not from thieves, but from time itself. As word spread, archivists searched census logs, land deeds, church records, anything that could explain who the family was or why their image had been hidden so far from civilization. Nothing matched. The forest had no official name in records from that era, only vague references to land deemed unsuitable for settlement. Yet the portrait insisted otherwise. It showed people who had lived, stood, and waited in that place long enough to be captured forever. Even before restoration began, those handling the painting reported an odd sense of interruption, as though they had disturbed something mid-sentence, the silence around the portrait feeling less like emptiness and more like restraint, like voices pressed just beneath the surface of the canvas, waiting for the moment the lid was lifted and light returned again. The restoration began as a routine process, careful and methodical, performed under controlled light by experts accustomed to fragile artifacts. The canvas was stabilized first, its warped fibers slowly coaxed back into alignment, every movement documented. As layers of grime were lifted millimeter by millimeter, the visible family grew sharper, their expressions becoming more defined, their eyes unsettlingly clear. What troubled the restorers was not what emerged in the foreground, but what refused to stay hidden behind it. Infrared scans revealed inconsistencies in the background, areas where pigment density did not match the surrounding forest. At first, it appeared to be damage or shadowing caused by age, but as the imaging deepened, shapes began to form. Long vertical smears aligned too precisely to be trees. Rounded patches suggested faces, blurred not by time, but by intention. Someone had painted over them, thinning the layers just enough that the original image could still breathe beneath the surface. When the background was digitally enhanced, the room fell quiet. Behind the family stood figures partially obscured by darkness, their forms incomplete, as if caught mid-emergence. Some appeared to be watching the camera, others turned toward the forest, mouths slightly open, their outlines softened to near invisibility. None of these figures appeared in any known documentation of early photography practices. They were not artifacts of exposure, nor accidents of technique. They had been there from the beginning. The most disturbing detail was their placement. These figures were not random. They formed a loose semicircle around the family, positioned just far enough back to be overlooked at first glance, yet close enough to feel intentional. Their scale suggested adults and children alike, but their faces lacked definition, as though identity itself had been withheld. The restorers debated whether the painter, or photographer, had attempted to erase them later, perhaps under pressure, perhaps out of fear. As the days passed, those working on the portrait noticed subtle changes. In enhanced images taken hours apart, certain shapes appeared slightly more pronounced, shadows deepening where none had been before. No physical alterations were found on the canvas, yet the digital layers told a different story. It was as if the image responded to attention, rewarding scrutiny with revelation. One restorer reported hearing a faint overlapping murmur while isolating the background frequencies, dismissing it at first as electrical interference. But when the audio equipment was removed, the sensation remained, a pressure in the ears, a sense of being surrounded. The portrait no longer felt like a single captured moment, but a threshold, separating what was allowed to be remembered from what had been deliberately pushed into the dark. The search for answers shifted from laboratories to archives, where dust and silence carried their own weight. Historians began with regional repositories, convinced the portrait had to belong to a known settlement whose records were simply incomplete. Instead, they found gaps where information should have been, entire decades reduced to vague annotations and crossed-out references. Land maps from the period showed the forested area as empty, marked with marginal notes warning against habitation, yet older survey drafts hinted at cleared land, footpaths, even property boundaries that no longer existed. The breakthrough came from a private collection donated decades earlier and never fully catalogued. Among brittle journals and correspondence was a leather-bound ledger written by a traveling schoolmaster, its pages filled with names that appeared nowhere else. The entries described a small woodland community, isolated by choice, bound together by shared labor and an unspoken rule about outsiders. The dates aligned precisely with the etched marking on the portrait's frame. The final entries grew fragmented, sentences trailing off, references to nights filled with sound, and meetings held without lanterns. More disturbing was the abrupt end of the journal. The last page bore no farewell, only a list of names repeated again and again, some crossed out, others circled heavily as if the writer could not decide who belonged where. Cross-referencing those names led nowhere. Church registries, birth records, death notices, all fell silent at the same point in time. It was as if an entire population had been carefully removed, not erased violently, but methodically, with bureaucratic precision. Additional journals surfaced in distant archives, written by surveyors, traders, and officials who passed near the forest but never entered it. Each mentioned the settlement obliquely, often contradicting official reports. One described seeing lights between the trees where maps insisted there were none. Another referenced a commissioned portrait meant to settle a dispute of presence, suggesting the image had been created as proof that the community existed at all. The most unsettling document was a government memorandum stamped but never signed. It declared the settlement invalid, its residents unrecognized, their claims void due to unspecified irregularities. The land was to be reclassified as undeveloped, all references struck from future editions. No explanation followed, only an instruction to retrieve and suppress certain materials, including a visual record stored beyond the boundary. As historians pieced these fragments together, the portrait ceased to be an anomaly and became evidence of a deliberate omission. It was not merely forgotten, but actively excluded, a witness to lives deemed inconvenient. The forest was no longer just a location, but a margin where history had been edited, and the voices tied to that image were beginning to sound less like echoes and more like objections still waiting to be acknowledged. The first report was dismissed as stress, the predictable side effect of long hours spent staring into a past that refused to stay still. A junior archivist claimed she heard whispering while cataloging high-resolution scans late at night, a layered sound that seemed to overlap itself, like several people speaking at once without taking turns. There was no clear language, only cadence and urgency, a rhythm that suggested conversation rather than noise. When the room lights were switched on, the sound stopped, leaving behind an uncomfortable awareness of silence rather than relief. Within days, others experienced the same phenomenon. A restoration technician working alone described hearing his name spoken from behind him, softly, insistently, though no one else was present. Another historian noted that the murmurs only occurred when the background figures were isolated on screen, as if attention acted as an invitation. Audio recordings of the room captured nothing unusual, yet everyone who listened agreed that the absence itself felt wrong, like something refusing to be documented. Patterns began to emerge. The whispers were strongest in enclosed spaces, especially after dusk, and often accompanied by a sudden drop in ambient temperature. Several researchers reported identical phrases, fragmented and incomplete, words that made little sense alone but repeated across testimonies. None could trace the phrases to known dialects, yet all described them with the same certainty, as if recognition came before understanding. Sleep became difficult for those involved. Dreams grew vivid and crowded, filled with unfamiliar faces standing just beyond reach, mouths moving in unison. Some woke with the sensation of having interrupted a conversation already in progress. Others felt watched while awake, not with threat, but expectation, as though the portrait demanded something in return for what it revealed. Attempts to distance staff from the project only intensified the disturbances, the whispers following them into unrelated workspaces, sometimes into their homes. A linguist brought in to assess the report suggested auditory pareidolia, the brain imposing meaning onto random sound. The theory collapsed when multiple people, working separately, documented the same sequence of tones, the same rise and fall, timed precisely to specific visual elements in the image. The voices seemed anchored not to the room, but to the figures hidden in the dark behind the family. What unsettled the team most was the growing sense that the whispers were not warnings, nor threats, but corrections. Each time a historical assumption was challenged, the sounds intensified, as if urging alignment rather than fear. The portrait no longer felt passive. It behaved like a participant, responding to inquiry with pressure rather than answers, its unseen figures pressing closer to audibility, waiting for the moment someone finally listened closely enough to understand what they had been trying to say all along. The realization did not arrive as a revelation, but as a slow, uncomfortable alignment of facts that refused to remain separate. One senior historian began tracing discrepancies between published timelines and the newly uncovered documents, expecting minor errors or regional inconsistencies. Instead, entire events appeared to shift when the portrait was introduced into the analysis, dates no longer lining up, references losing their anchors. It was as though history itself resisted accommodating the image, bending away from it rather than absorbing it. Further examination revealed that several accepted historical narratives depended on the absence of the woodland settlement. Trade routes, population movements, even boundary disputes had been explained using gaps that now appeared intentional. When the names from the journals were hypothetically reinserted into census projections, population models changed significantly, altering assumptions about migration, labor distribution, and regional influence. The portrait was not simply filling a blank space. It was exposing how that blank space had been used to support an entire framework of understanding. What made the discovery more disturbing was evidence that earlier historians may have encountered traces of the settlement and quietly redirected their conclusions. Marginal notes in academic drafts showed abrupt changes in wording, cautious phrases replacing confident assertions. One annotated manuscript referenced unverified presence before the phrase was struck through entirely. The portrait explained why. Acknowledging the settlement meant acknowledging an act of removal that was not accidental, but sanctioned. As the team worked through the implications, they noticed a pattern in what had been erased. The missing lives belonged to those who lived communally, outside conventional ownership structures, resisting formal classification. Their exclusion simplified history, made it cleaner, more controllable. By denying their existence, institutions avoided explaining why such a community was allowed to disappear without record or response. The portrait threatened that simplicity by insisting these people had stood before a lens and demanded to be seen. The historian leading the project described the image as an intervention rather than a document. Unlike letters or artifacts, it could not be reinterpreted into harmless context. Faces, even obscured ones, demanded acknowledgement. The figures in the background, once dismissed as shadows, now appeared essential, representing those whose removal made the foreground possible. The family's rigid posture took on new meaning, less a sign of formality than compliance. As these conclusions circulated, resistance followed. Requests were made to delay publication, to frame findings as speculative. Funding reviews were announced. Yet the work continued, driven by the understanding that the portrait had already done its damage. By existing, it forced history to confront its own editing process, revealing that what was remembered had been chosen carefully, and that forgetting, in this case, had been an act with consequences that could no longer be contained. As the research reached its final stages, the disturbances no longer remained subtle. The whispers that once lingered at the edge of perception began to intrude with clarity, not louder, but more deliberate. Those closest to the portrait reported the sensation of being addressed rather than overhearing, the sounds tightening into patterns that followed moments of recognition. Each confirmed fact, each restored name, seemed to draw a response, as if the unseen figures were tracking progress with mounting impatience. Late-night recordings revealed faint rhythmic pulses beneath the ambient noise, not speech in any conventional sense, but a coordinated pressure that rose and fell in unison. When the restored image was projected at full scale, several observers felt compelled to step back, overwhelmed by the impression that the space between the figures and the room had narrowed. The background shapes appeared darker, more defined, their blurred edges sharpening just enough to suggest movement without providing proof. No physical change could be confirmed, yet no one who witnessed it doubted that something had shifted. As publication drafts circulated, the voices grew more insistent. Researchers described sudden waves of emotion that did not belong to them, urgency without fear, anger without direction. Dreams intensified, no longer symbolic but instructional, filled with repeated images of paths through the forest, gestures toward the camera, hands raised not in warning but insistence. Several staff members independently sketched the same unfamiliar symbol upon waking, matching the one etched on the portrait's frame. Attempts to remove the painting from the facility only worsened the phenomenon. During transport, those present reported a deep, resonant hum vibrating through the crate, felt more in the chest than the ears. The sensation ceased only when the portrait was returned to view, as though concealment itself had become intolerable. It became clear that the image no longer served as evidence alone. It functioned as a conduit, strengthened by recognition, weakened by denial. The turning point came when the final report was approved for release. In the hours leading up to publication, the whispers reached a synchronized clarity, not words but intent, a collective demand for completion. The figures in the background no longer felt passive or trapped. They felt mobilized. Observers described the overwhelming certainty that these voices had waited a century not for discovery, but for acknowledgement, for the moment when omission would be named and corrected. When the findings were finally made public, the disturbances ceased abruptly. The silence that followed was heavy but resolved, no longer restrained or expectant. The portrait remained unchanged, yet those who stood before it sensed that something had crossed over, not into the present, but into record. The voices did not fade because they were satisfied, but because they had achieved what they had been pressing toward all along, reclaiming their place in history by forcing the living to listen and ensuring they could never again be consigned to the dark.